Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Colleen King. I'm director of the Richard and Leslie Frank Center for Leadership and Innovation in Media and clinical assistant professor of journalism here at Illinois. And I am so pleased to introduce all of you tonight to one of our finest alums and one of the all-time greats of political journalism, Dan Balz of the Washington Post, where he is chief correspondent and worked for more than 4 decades. He's covered it all. And on top of that, he's written a few New York Times bestselling books as well. He earned his bachelor's and master's in journalism here at Illinois, and he was editor-in-chief of the Daily Alumni. Having grown up in Freeport, he even met his wife here on campus. So we are excited to see Nancy as well on the webinar. In 2021, Dan was the inaugural recipient of our College of Media Distinguished Alumni Award, and we are so grateful he was kind enough to be here with us tonight. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, and it's a special treat to be invited back to the U of I, even in this virtual setting. Nancy and I miss the campus, and we get back when we can, but I'm thrilled to be able to do this and look forward to the conversation. So thank you.
That'd be great. Well, I know several members of our audience submitted questions ahead of time, which will work in here to our conversation. And also, please, those of you in the audience, use that question and answer box. We will be keeping an eye on that so we can ask questions in real time too, as you submit them. So let me just get started here tonight. We are hours away from Election Day. Because neither candidate, Democrat Raphael Warnock and Republican Herschel Walker, reached the 50% threshold in the general election. So can you set the scene for us tonight based on your reporting and that of your colleagues at the Post? What's the mood tonight in Georgia? Does anyone feel like they have an edge headed into tomorrow?
I think the Democrats feel as though they have an edge, but I think we have to reinforce the idea that an edge in Georgia is a very small a small margin. I was looking back today just to refresh myself on the past elections that we've seen over the last year.
Yeah.
And basically everything is, 1 point, 2 points is a landslide in Georgia right now in these Senate races. And in the first round in November, it was less than a point between Senator Warnock and Herschel Walker. The Democrats feel good for a couple of reasons. One is that the early vote has been strong. There have been more than 1.8 million people who voted early, which is not as much as in the general election, but you wouldn't expect it to be. Runoff elections generally have smaller turnout. But the Democrats feel that they have an edge in that early vote, which means Republicans, in order to take this seat away from the Democrats, will have to do it tomorrow on election day. Mm-hmm. Now, Republicans tend to vote more on election day than to vote early, and Democrats the opposite. But nonetheless, the Democrats think that they have a decent margin and perhaps a slightly better margin than they had last year at this time going into the runoff election. But Georgia, in many ways, Georgia is, we call it a kind of a purple state because Biden won it and it has now 2 Democratic senators. But the governor, Governor Kemp, won by a pretty good margin over a tough opponent, Stacey Abrams, in November. And we know that this is a very partisan environment, and that while this is not going to determine control of the Senate, it could have a lot to do with the degree to which Democrats have some advantages in turning to do some of the things they want to do. So as I say, the Democrats feel that they've got a little bit of an edge, but they're not, they haven't claimed victory yet by any means.
Yes, and to your point, we had a couple of audience questions submitted earlier about the Democrats in the Senate. John Beck wanted to know, what would the practical effect of a Warnock victory be in the Senate, since Democrats would have 51 seats? And Jennifer Aniston asked, how might the runoff affect the business of the Senate?
Well, on the first question, it's an important question because in a 50-50 Senate, the committees are basically divided 50-50. And so if the Democrats hold the Warnock seat tomorrow, and therefore have 51, then they will have a tiny majority on all the committees. And that can make a big difference in moving legislation. If you have tie votes, you can't get something out of a committee. And judicial appointments become easier in that environment. And we know that that's a very, very important element of having control of the Senate, because for these judicial appointments, it now only requires a majority vote. So the Democrats would have that advantage. I think a second one, and it will be hard to measure this in the abstract, but we'll see going forward. We know that in a 50-50 Senate, with Vice President Harris being able to break the tie, that Senator Joe Manchin in particular, but also Senator Kyrsten Sinema, had enormous power because all of those votes were needed. And so whatever Manchin wanted, Manchin often got, or the legislation didn't get through. His vote becomes slightly less vital unless he and Sinema team up on everything. But that is not an insignificant difference. On the other hand, because the House is now in Republican hands, it's not as though the Democrats can simply get their way in the Senate and therefore expect things will go through. I think we're looking at 2 years of mostly gridlock.
Got it. Can you talk about Herschel Walker as a candidate and how several controversies have plagued him both in the general and now in the runoff? Talk about his candidacy for us.
Well, his candidacy is, I guess, the gentlest way to put it, has been quite problematic. On the one hand, Herschel Walker has been a hero in Georgia because of his exploits at the University of Georgia, winning the Heisman Trophy and national championship. And he has been a beloved figure as an athlete. But this election has revealed another side to Herschel Walker. And I think it falls into two categories. One is a character question. There have been any number of things that have arisen about his character. The fact that he, according to allegations, paid for a girlfriend to have an abortion. His ex-wife said that at one point he held a gun to her head. And the Democrats have run, tens of millions of dollars of advertising pointing out those issues. The second aspect has to do with what I would call the substance of his candidacy. And there has been very little substance to his candidacy. He has basically avoided any media other than very friendly media. He doesn't do press conferences. I read something today in the Atlanta papers that indicated that in recent weeks now, his campaign has basically kept the press 20 feet or more away from him. So he has run a very insulated campaign. Georgia voters don't know where he really stands on some important issues. So one of the columnists for the Journal-Constitution, Patricia Murphy, wrote a column over the weekend that basically said Herschel Walker's candidacy has been beneath Georgia, and she acknowledged in this column that she was a huge fan of Herschel Walker when she was younger and watching him play football, but she feels that the campaign he's run has not been up to the moment. Having said that, he could win this election tomorrow because people tend to vote party allegiance and set other issues aside.
One of the members of our audience, Daniela Marin, asked, why do you believe many Americans today are voting for party affiliation over controversial moral positions? Do you see that happening here in Georgia?
Well, I think we do see that, not just in Georgia, but I think we see that in many places. But it's kind of, in neon lights in Georgia because of all of the controversy surrounding Herschel Walker. I mean, he's become kind of the poster candidate for character issues that, in one way or another, many voters are choosing to overlook. I think that it goes to the nature of where we are in this country at this point, and it's not that we are suddenly landed in this point in the end of 2022. We've been this way for quite some time, and particularly since President Trump was elected. We're a very polarized country. And the single best indicator of how someone will vote in which candidate someone will vote for in an election is their party affiliation. 90 to 95% of people who think of themselves as Republicans will vote for the Republican candidate, and vice versa on the Democratic side. And one of the reasons for setting aside, as the questioner asked, setting aside some of these moral questions, is the issue to some people that if the other side, if the other party has control, they're going to take the country in a direction that is not just disagreeable to people, but anathema to people. The sense of kind of an apocalyptic choice enters into the way people think about how they're going to vote in an election. And so I think that's what we have seen in this election. There are any number of Republicans in Georgia who do not like some of the things that Herschel Walker is reputed to have done, but nonetheless will vote for him because in their estimation, a Democratic Senate and a Democratic government would go way, way left. And similarly, we see the same thing with Democrats about Republicans. So I think that's the nature of it. It's the consequences of not voting with your party and seeing your party not have power. So much of politics today is about gaining or regaining power. And that's what we see in election after election.
Could you talk a little bit about another powerful person in Georgia, Brian Kemp, who received more votes than his fellow Republican Herschel Walker, and what's going on there?
Yeah, well, Governor Kemp, as we know, after the 2020 election, certified Joe Biden as the winner of the 2020 election in Georgia by roughly 12,000 votes. There was a recount and there was another recount. Former President Trump disagreed with that. And as we know, he called Brad Raffensperger, who's the Republican Secretary of State, at the beginning of 2021 and implored him to quote unquote find 11,780 votes, which he said was all he would need in order to claim the victory in that state. Governor Kemp stood up to him and certified the election and continued to insist that they had run a fair election, that they had looked into all of the allegations, that the Secretary of State's office had done its job properly, and that there were no grounds to what President Trump, former President Trump, was saying about what had happened in that election. I think it's interesting that in the Republican primary earlier this year, Governor Kemp had a challenger, David Perdue, former senator, who lost his seat a year ago. And David Perdue bought into the Trump lie about what had happened in the election and ran in that way against Governor Kemp. Governor Kemp swamped him in the Republican primary. I mean, it was an indication that a huge majority of Republican voters in Georgia were going against the former president and supporting Governor Kemp. And I think it was at that moment that a lot of people looked at Governor Kemp and said, he is going to be very, very difficult to beat in the general election, even though Stacey Abrams is a very strong and skilled candidate who has built an organization in Georgia that has helped Democrats gain ground and that certainly helped President Biden win his election and helped the two Georgia senators win their runoffs a year ago. So Governor Kemp is a strong political figure in the state. And I think there was a hope among a lot of Republicans nationally who recognized that Herschel Walker was a weak candidate, that a strong performance by Governor Kemp would pull Walker across the finish line, that they could get him over 50% in the first round. That didn't happen. Governor Kemp won fairly easily. He had a much bigger margin this time than he did 4 years ago against Stacey Abrams, but he was not able to get Herschel Walker over 50%. Walker fell a little bit short of Warnock. I mean, he came in a near, it was almost a tie, but he came in second, and so that's the issue here. Governor Kemp has campaigned on behalf of Walker. done advertising on behalf of Walker. I mean, he's played the role of the loyal party leader to try to get Walker over the line this time around. But he is seen differently in Georgia by Republicans and by some Democrats, I think. So you saw that fall off in his vote versus Walker's.
So Kemp has been active in the Walker campaign, especially in the last few days, but one person who's been absent has been Donald Trump. To what effect do you think that has here in the past few weeks of this runoff election?
Well, it's probably been in Herschel Walker's favor that Donald Trump has stayed out of it. I think that many Republicans believe that what Trump did a year ago during the runoff period, the post-election pre-runoff period, in which he was continuing to claim the election was stolen and everything else that went along with it, that hurt the two Republicans in those runoff races. That in a sense it sent a signal that that something was corrupt about the Georgia voting process and that people shouldn't participate in it. And Republicans, I think after the November election, were holding their breath about him coming into the state and doing another big rally or something like that. Now, he may be doing a virtual rally tonight, but that's pretty small beans, and particularly where we are at this moment. So he has stayed out. I think he's been advised to stay out. But I also think it's an indication, and maybe we'll get on to this a little bit later. It's an indication to the degree to which he's in a somewhat different place than he was a year ago, or even 6 months ago. He's still the dominant figure in the party, but not quite what he was.
Oh, we could carry on with that. I mean, you've called him, I believe, an embattled candidate here, headed into a re-election bid. How much will Republicans want to be on his side, Keir, going into 2024?
Well, he still has the base of the party, or he still has the MAGA base of the party, which is not an insignificant percentage of people who call themselves Republicans. And if he has as he did in 2016, if he has a big field of opponents and they kind of split all of the anti-Trump vote, because of Republican rules in the primaries, it's a winner take all system, unlike the Democrats, which is proportional distribution of delegates. You can win all the delegates with a plurality victory in these primaries. It's possible that will be his, and it certainly has to be his route to victory. But what we're seeing is that there is support for other candidates, and in particular, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who had a quite handsome re-election victory in November, 59% of the vote. He captured the Hispanic vote in Florida comfortably. He won Miami-Dade County. He is a strong potential challenger. He has not said that he is going to challenge Donald Trump in the Republican primaries, but there are a lot of Republicans who believe it is likely. There's an old notion that if you're somebody who is in the kind of position that DeSantis is, you don't quite get to pick your moment when you run for president. That you have to run when you're when the focus is on you and when you're strongest, which is what Barack Obama did in 2008. It seemed awfully sudden for him to run for president, but as David Axelrod, his strategist, said at the time, you'll never be hotter than you are now, and history is replete with people who waited too long. So I think that people expect that Governor DeSantis will get in, but there will be other candidates who will also challenge. And so, all the indications are, again, as I said, that Donald Trump remains the dominant figure, but the November election hurt him. He is responsible in some ways for the Republicans not winning the Senate. If you look at the candidates that he, in one way or another, promoted or forced onto the ballot and forced through the primaries, there are three races that Republicans might have won with other candidates. One obviously is in Georgia with a different kind of candidate. They might have been able to defeat Senator Warnock in November, and we wouldn't be in this runoff situation. In Pennsylvania, if Dr. Oz had not been the candidate, it's not necessarily likely, but it's probable that that race would have been much closer, and the Republicans might have won that race and held a seat that they gave up to John Fetterman. In Arizona, Mark Kelly, who ran a very skillful race, but nonetheless had an opponent in Blake Masters who was very Trumpy and Trumpian. And what we saw in Arizona was that the kind of the Trump wing of the party ended up getting shut out. They lost the governor's race, they lost the Senate race, and they lost the Secretary of State's race. So people look at that and say, you know, the former president, by doing what he has done, may have cost us the United States Senate. And is that what we want heading into 2024? Do we want a nominee who has proven that he is a flawed general election candidate? I mean, if you look at his record, he won the Electoral College in 2016. We have to give him that. He won it by a decent majority, but he lost the popular vote. In 2018, his party lost the House. In 2020, he lost the presidency and his party lost the Senate. And in 2022, in a time when people thought that the Republicans might be riding a red wave toward a pretty solid majority in the House of Representatives, they barely scraped through. They're going to have a majority of maybe with 222 members. That is not the kind of record that many Republicans are going to want as their standard bearer in 24. So I think that's the challenge that Trump will face.
One of our audience members, Sharon, wondered today, does the press overdo its coverage of Trump, and does that embolden him? What do you think?
That's a good and important question, and it's one, frankly, that we wrestle with constantly. I mean, we've already at our place sat down and talked about what do we do in 2024? How should it be different from 2020, if at all? How should it have been different from 2016? I think that the challenge for us is to cover him adequately. He is the front runner for the Republican nomination. And historically, I think that the press gives more attention to a front runner than to a dark horse. But one of the reasons for that is you give that person attention because you give them more scrutiny. And I think that the scrutiny that'll go along with Donald Trump this time will be sharper than it might have been in 2020 or certainly 2016. There is a lot about what Donald Trump has done and continues to talk about that needs to be elevated. I mean, just over the weekend, he did the tweet in which he basically said, there's fraud in the election. It should be overturned, and this is a moment in which we should throw out all the rules and regulations, including in the Constitution. He didn't say throw out the Constitution, but he essentially said throw out everything that's in the Constitution. Now, the press got a little bit of criticism from the left for not jumping on that harder in their newspapers of a day ago. This happened on Saturday, and so I think we are mindful of needing to keep the questions about Donald Trump's fitness for the presidency and the authoritarian aspects of what he is saying and doing, and remind people of that. Now, there's some people who say we should simply ignore him, who blame the press for elevating him in 2016. I think at the beginning of his candidacy, he did get more free coverage than he probably deserved. But he had this kind of celebrity notion, and he was rewriting the rules of presidential politics and drawing substantial crowds, which, as we learned over time, meant that he had a real following. So it's a long answer to a very, very good question, but we we kind of look at it with some general principles in mind, but also knowledgeable and recognizing that every new iteration of this requires us to weigh and consider and decide exactly how to do it.
Mhm. Paul asked, will the Republicans move to advance stronger policy-based candidates after this midterm failure of so many?
Well, I think they would like to, but those decisions are in the hands of the primary voters, turnout in primaries. And what we saw in 2022 is that those primary voters tended in many places to go along with what Donald Trump preferred. So in 2016, the Republican establishment did not want Donald Trump to be the nominee. But we were reminded that party establishments have very little control over these nominating processes, whether it's a presidential series of primaries or House or Senate or gubernatorial primaries. It's who puts their names on the ballot, what kind of support they are able to attract, and how many voters they can turn out. So certainly the lesson of 2022 is that this is not a country that is looking to elect election deniers. Election deniers around the country, the most prominent of them, at least, were not selected by the voters in those states in a general election. That sends a message to the Republican establishment. But does it send a message to Donald Trump and his most ardent followers? I think that remains to be seen.
Gary Rowe has asked here while we've been chatting, given the polarization between the two major parties, do you think a new, more centrist party could be viable?
I'm skeptical of that. I know there are a lot of people who would like to see that, and it's interesting when you talk to voters, whether they're on the left or the right or the center, they do share a sentiment that the system isn't working. And they wish that in one way or another, Congress and the president could find a way to be more productive. Now, the catch on that is that people on the left want the government to be productive on a certain set of issues, and people on the right have a wholly different set of issues. We now have a kind of a polarized policy environment. There's not as much middle as there used to be. Though over the first 2 years of the Biden administration, there were a number of pieces of legislation that got some bipartisan support, enough bipartisan support to get through the Senate with 60 votes, which is the requirement unless you use the arcane method called reconciliation. So there has been some ability to create some common ground for things like infrastructure, for technology, the CHIPS bill, for example, even a gun safety bill, which is quite modest. I mean, we shouldn't think that this was a major step forward, but nonetheless, it was the first gun safety legislation in a decade. One of the aspects is about a more centrist party. This has been talked about by many people over many years. I think there are several obstacles to it. One is that people who are independent voters, for example, are not necessarily ideologically homogenous. They may be independent because they don't really want to align themselves formally with one party or another, but many of them lean left or lean right. So that the number of people in the middle is actually fairly small. The other aspect of this is, just in a practical sense, it is very, very difficult for any third party entity or candidate to get the kind of traction that they would need to be able to win elections. In some ways, Donald Trump was a kind of a model for an independent candidacy. He had celebrity, he had money. He didn't really have a fixed ideology. Was kind of, left in some ways and right in some ways and populist in other ways. But he smartly understood that if he ran as an independent, as a third party candidate, like Ross Perot did many, many years ago, that you can't win an electoral college majority. And so basically what he did was he hijacked the Republican Party. So the idea of a centrist party is appealing to a lot of people because it might bring us back to common ground, but the practical obstacles are still enormous.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the Democratic Party for a moment, because there was a move last week that you wrote that said it made it abundantly clear that Joe Biden intends to run for re-election in 2024. Tell us what that move was and what change is coming here.
Well, every 4 years, there is a discussion within the Democratic Party of how to structure the series of presidential primaries that will take place in the next presidential election. And for a long time, there's been jealousy about Iowa and New Hampshire being the first two states in the process. Both are small states, and one of the reasons that they are there is that they've developed a kind of a culture in those states of people turning out for small candidate events and kind of judging the candidates and turning out for the Iowa caucuses or the New Hampshire primary. But both, in addition to being small, are pretty unrepresentative of the country as a whole at this point. We're a very diverse country, and both of those states are predominantly white. And in a Democratic Party where the coalition is highly diverse, the idea that those two states should in one way or another be the first testing grounds has people have objected to that. And so there has been a committee as part of the Democratic National Committee looking at what to do for 2024. And they were preparing for their final session last weekend, but everybody was kind of waiting for the president to weigh in. And everybody knew that Iowa was going to not be one of the first 4 early states. All those early states have to be given a waiver by the National Committee in order to hold their events before the formal start of the process. So people were waiting for the president to weigh in. And on Thursday night, he weighed in with a proposal that caught everybody by surprise, which was he moved South Carolina, which has historically been one of the early states, but generally 3rd or 4th. He said that should be the first state. That it is time that Black voters, who are the heart and soul of the Democratic coalition, the most loyal voters, the voters who give the Democrats the highest percentage of their votes, that they deserve to go at the beginning, and that South Carolina that should therefore be first. He said that Nevada and New Hampshire should share the second date, and then after that, he said Michigan, which had been talked about as a Midwestern substitute for Iowa, should be part of the mix. But he also put Georgia in the mix, and so you would have 5 states. So in talking to people about this as this was unfolding, it became pretty clear that while this met the principles that he talked about, which was more diversity, economic diversity, geographic diversity, demographic diversity, that the different regions of the country be represented, that Black voters be given the prime place in the calendar, and that the union states of Nevada and Michigan be part of this early state mix. All of that met his principles, but as I wrote over the weekend, those principles happen to align very, very nicely with his political self-interest. He ran 4th in Iowa in the caucuses last time. He ran 5th in New Hampshire. He's the first candidate who's made it to the presidency who didn't finish either 1st or 2nd in New Hampshire. His candidacy was saved in South Carolina with the help of Representative Jim Clyburn, who endorsed him before the primary, and by the votes of Black voters who gave him an overwhelming support. And so this calendar is exactly what he would want if by chance he receives a challenge from the left, whoever that might be, a Bernie Sanders-like candidate. Sanders has indicated that he supports President Biden, but a Sanders-like candidate, they would have a very tough go in South Carolina, and they might have a tough go in these other early states. There's been a lot of talk about whether Biden would run or should run. He's not a young man after all. He just turned 80. He'd be 82 if he wins in 2024. He'd be 82 when he's sworn in. And prior to the November election, there was a fair amount of conversation within the Democratic Party about whether it made sense for him to be the candidate, to be the party's nominee, or was it time for a different generation? The fact that Democrats did a lot better than they were expected to do has kind of quieted a lot of that talk. But when you look at this new calendar for the Democrats in 2024, it says, as President Biden has said, that he intends to run and that he's going to make this as favorable to him, which is an incumbent's prerogative and the leader of his party prerogative to do so. I mean, he flexed his muscles and the party went along with it. There was a lot of grumbling. New Hampshire's not going to go along with this. They'll jump the line, and Iowa may do similarly, but they'll be penalized for that, and candidates would stay away. So, it was just a measure of this is a very political politician. And if people thought he was going to be passive about it, they got a reminder that he wasn't going to be.
That's right. Well, for the next 2 years, if he does run again, he will be up against a Republican House majority, a narrow one. And we have a question from our Associate Dean, Stephanie Kraft, who's asking, do you anticipate that Kevin McCarthy will be elected Speaker? And that is, how seriously do you take the comments of Andy Biggs and others that they won't vote for him?
Well, I think we have to take those comments very seriously. Kevin McCarthy has basically no margin for error. There are enough people who have indicated that they don't support him at this time to be the Speaker, that he is having to work enormously hard to line up those votes. Nancy Pelosi has sometimes faced similar questions about her. There are people who ran in 2018 said they would not support her candidacy for Speaker if they were elected to the House. Nancy Pelosi, as we have long known and saw again in 2018 and 2020 and again this year, is an enormously skilled leader and Speaker, and she easily overcame those challenges. Whether Kevin McCarthy is anywhere in the same league as Nancy Pelosi, we're going to begin to find out over the next month as he tries to nail this down. I think one question someone at our office said today, it might be that if Donald Trump weighs in on behalf of Kevin McCarthy, in the days or weeks before the vote, that might tip the scales enough for McCarthy to be elected and not have to worry. McCarthy, as we know, has courted Donald Trump almost from the minute after he, said that Donald Trump should be held responsible for what happened on January 6th. I mean, he quickly, changed his tune and went down to Mar-a-Lago and had his picture taken with the president, and he's curried favor with the president ever since. So he might be hoping that the former president will weigh in on his behalf. But our congressional reporters are tracking this, on a daily basis, if you will. And the sense is at this point, almost a month from the vote, that he doesn't have it yet, but we'll see. But it is a reminder of, let's say he wins the speakership. It's a reminder of what he's going to go through for 2 years. In the same way that Pelosi had a very narrow majority over the last 2 years and had to, figure out how to keep the progressive caucus happy and the moderates in line at the same time and bring everybody aboard. He's going to have it even worse, I suspect. Pelosi had long experience in herding those cats, and he has less experience, and I would say at this point is probably less skilled than Pelosi, but he's a smart politician. I don't think we should underestimate his ability. I mean, he's made it this far. He's maneuvered his way through this. He's held people together, and we'll see. But it's going to be a rough ride for 2 years. Every recent Republican speaker has had to deal with this. I mean, Paul Ryan had to deal with this.
John Boehner, yeah,
and John Boehner especially. I mean, it drove
Yes.
John Boehner out of the Congress at a moment when people didn't expect that he was going to just pull the plug. So this is not new in the Republican conference.
right. I've got another question here from Moss Bresnahan, who runs WILL. And he asked, it seems the GOP plans to conduct their own January 6th investigations now that they'll have the majority. How should the media approach its coverage to distinguish between a congressional investigation done in good faith versus one that might weaponize and undermine the process?
Well, I think I think whatever they decide to do, and this may not be the only investigation that they launch. I mean, our expectation is that there are any number of investigations that they want to launch. One of the things that they have talked about in criticism of the January 6th committee is that it has not looked as hard as it should at the security breaches. Why wasn't the Capitol ready for what happened? Now, there have been other investigations that have looked at that and have drawn conclusions. So it's not as though they would be plowing brand new ground, but nonetheless, they may want to do that. I think you can tell from watching a legitimate inquiry versus one that's just a highly politicized inquiry. I know there are Republicans who feel that the January 6th investigation has been highly politicized, but the truth of the matter is the people who have testified in that set of public hearings have been Republicans, have been the people who have been around Donald Trump, who told the story of what happened on January 6th and ahead of January 6th. And that testimony has painted a very dark picture of what was going on inside the Trump White House and in the circles around that. And so if the Republicans launch a set of hearings about January 6th, I think people will be able to fairly judge what kind of investigation it is and what is the purpose of it. As you may or may not recall, when the Republicans controlled the House and they did the series of investigations into what had happened in Benghazi during Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State. As I recall, Kevin McCarthy said at one point on Fox, "Well, look at what's happened as a result of these hearings. Nancy Pelosi or Hillary Clinton's favorables have gone way down." I mean, it was kind of speaking the truth out loud, which is that the goal of those hearings was to damage her politically. So we'll see what happens. But the January 6th investigation by Republicans in the new Congress, will have to stand the test of authenticity and veracity.
I would love to talk to you more generally about political journalism, because I see several student names here in attendance tonight. And for those students who are learning how to craft leads, write nut graphs, all those kinds of things, what advice do you have for our up and coming writers here on campus?
The first bit of advice I would give is to read good journalism. I will go back to something that happened to me when I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois and was a teaching assistant. And I was teaching the basic journalism class. And we were doing essentially a rudimentary exercise in how to write a story about a traffic accident. And assignment went out and the papers came back in, and I looked at them, and any number of them were written in present tense. 2 people are dead and 1 is injured in a traffic accident, blah, blah, blah. And I looked at that, and so I said to the people in the class, how many people here read a newspaper on any regular basis? And there may have been 1 hand that was raised. I may be being generous. There may be 1 or 2 hands, but basically nobody was reading the newspaper. And I said to them, writing a lead is not it is not rocket science, but you have to know what good writing is and what are the elements of a good lead. And Colleen, as you said, what makes a nut graph? A nut graph is that graph high up in a story that tells people why this story is important and what it is that they are going to get a further explanation of if they would keep reading. So the first thing is to find good journalism and read it and kind of decipher it, demystify it, if you will. So that's one thing. Another is, and I think this has always been a hallmark of University of Illinois journalism education, and that is there are the professional courses that are required and they are essential. I wouldn't have gotten out of the University of Illinois with the skills I had without the practical courses that I got in the Department of Journalism. But the other is to have as broad a possible knowledge of the world as you can get. In a sense, if you are a journalist, particularly starting out, you're going to be a generalist. You're going to be asked to write about a lot of things you don't know anything about, or you know very little about, and you're going to have to learn quickly. You're going to have to be a quick study, and mastering, again, some rudimentary knowledge of a variety of things, whether it's history or political science or sociology or science or technology, or you name it. That is a helpful foundation as you are starting out. It's just it's part of what you need as a journalist. When I got hired, the first job I had in Washington was at a magazine called National Journal, and the job I was offered at the time, this was right out of grad school, was to cover domestic economic policy. And the editor offered me this job, and I said, I'll be honest with you, I don't really know anything about economics. I had taken one economics course at the University of Illinois, but I said, I don't really have any deep knowledge of this topic. And covering at the national level, I thought this is going to be fairly daunting. And his answer was, our belief is that if you are a good journalist, you can master the subject. If you know how to write, if you know how to report, you can learn what you need to know in order to write at a depth level and be able to do it. So I think it's those two things that you need to come to bring together.
How do you couple that with building interviewing skills?
Well, that's a great question, and I will be honest with you. I think I have never thought, honestly, that I am a great interviewer. I think I can do pretty good interviews, but I see other people who are very, very good. But one of the ways you learn to do it is to do it. The first rule of doing interviews for any story you're working on is to do your homework. Don't go in without knowing what you really want to know and why you want to know it. Don't go in with just a bunch of vague questions. I'll tell you another story about myself. When I was in my senior year at Illinois, I was working on an independent study course, and I was doing something on Lyndon Johnson and whether he was going to run for re-election in 1968. And I had planned to go to Washington during spring break to do some interviewing out there with people. And for the younger people here, you wouldn't remember this, but just before I was heading out there, Johnson announced he was not running again. And I had planned to do this project, comparing it with Harry Truman's run in 1948. Well, that went out the window because Johnson wasn't running. So I had scheduled an interview with David Broder, who later became my mentor at the Washington Post, a great political reporter. And I went in to see David at the Post building in downtown Washington. And he was very gracious to make time. And we were sitting in this crowded newsroom, and I started to ask him some questions. And I honestly I was not well prepared, and I had not thought through how this project had to change. And he politely answered a couple of questions, and then he gave me this look, which, for those of us who remember David, we called it the look. He gave me the look, which you never really wanted to get from David, but he gave me this look and he said to me, "What do these questions have to do with your topic?" And it was a kind of it was a humiliating moment, and I had to kind of pick myself up off the floor and said, "Well, I'm frankly struggling a little bit with how this project should go." And David then, again, being enormously gracious, said, "Here's some things you ought to think about," and pointed me in the right direction. So on any interview, be prepared as much as you possibly can. Another thing, and again, I think I've watched some people who are very, very skilled about this. Don't interrupt people when you're interviewing them. If there is a pause, don't necessarily jump in, because the interviewee will probably be as uncomfortable with a pause as you might feel you are. And they will feel the need sometimes to open up more than they have. And if you just take kind of the first thing they say, and then you'll say, "Okay, my next question is this," and not wait and see if there is something more that comes out from them, that's also a helpful thing to keep in mind. And one other element that I think is very crucial in interviewing, and particularly if you're doing interviewing on television. I think interviewing on television and interviewing, for a news story or a big feature, they're different. And I think the skills are similar, but the strategy and tactics are different. But one of the things you have to remember is follow-up questions, because if you're interviewing a public figure, chances are that the first set of questions that you have prepared are questions that this person has been asked before. And again, I learned this, on Face the Nation a couple of times. This was in the old days when they used to have a panel along with the moderator, and Bob Schieffer was the moderator in those days. A panel of reporters who would also, or one or two reporters who would also ask the guests questions. And I remember I was on interviewing, and I can't even remember who, and I had a couple of questions, and the person answered them, and I realized I didn't have a good follow-up question, because they will give you the canned boilerplate question. So what you need to think about is, how do you structure that first question so that you are prepared with a second question that you really want to ask, that person might be less prepared for. And you'll see, if you watch people doing TV interviews, good TV interviewers, Jake Tapper's, I think, quite good at this. As Margaret Brennan, I have a great deal of admiration for her. But any number of people who do this, again, watch what the pros do. But those are some of the lessons that I've learned over the years.
Thank you. Final question here, and I'll circle back to our main topic at hand tonight. And that is, how should we be watching the Georgia results come in tomorrow? What will you be looking for? Are there any indications we should be keeping an eye out for?
Well, I think that one of the things we should look for tomorrow during the day is how big is the turnout. I think there is some not good weather forecast for Georgia, but it may be a little bit rainy in Georgia. If that's the case, it might tamp down turnout. But if there are very long lines, that would probably be a good sign for the Republicans. I think there are two things to look at. What is happening in the counties right around Atlanta? Those counties have been moving in the direction of Democrats now for half a dozen years, and they are critical for Warnock. Now he's tried to roll up vote in those counties in the early vote. But the other is, what's the strength of the turnout in those rural counties? Because That's where Republicans have won or lost elections in recent years. And Donald Trump has changed the nature of the vote in those small town and rural areas, in not just in Georgia, but in a lot of places. We saw it in Virginia in 2021 when Glenn Youngkin was able to win the governorship over the former governor, Terry McAuliffe. He not only got big margins in those rural counties, he got big turnout. So those are the two things to watch. And then we'll have to hope that that we're not heading into another election week in which it takes a week to count the votes, but that we have a pretty good indication of tomorrow night. But given the likelihood that this is going to be a close race, it could go well into the night before we really know.
Well, Dan Balz, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for answering all of our questions and taking part in this tonight with us.
Thank you, Colleen. It's been my pleasure, and thanks to everybody who's on the Zoom.
Yes.
And happy holidays to everybody.
Same to you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.